It's August 22nd, 2023, Calvin Castine at Lake Forest Community, and we're here for another Clinton County Historical Association presentation. And tonight we have Dr. James Lindgren.
Lindgren.
I had to cheat, I had to look.
2 syllables. Simple Swedish name. There's 20 pages or so in the Stockholm phone book with Lindgren, so I'm the James in Plattsburgh. Okay.
There's probably a few James over in Stockholm.
I would think so, but mostly there's Sven and Swedish names. Okay.
So you are a professor emeritus. What does that mean here at Plattsburgh State?
That means after teaching for 37 years at Plattsburgh State, I retired. And so I retired effective, 2021, and I've been footloose and free ever since. Okay.
This is how you spend your spare time then?
I was asked to do this, and so I was happy to help CCHA tell the story of Plattsburgh to its community and members.
Okay, you're going to tell, according to Helen Nurska, it's going to be a rather unique version of the history, right?
I'm not sure if it's unique, but the story isn't often told of, again, an area that was demolished, a neighborhood that was demolished to create perhaps the prettiest spot in Plattsburgh today.
Oh.
So if you again go to City Hall and McDonough Monument, it reflects the thinking of the early 20th century about what a city should look like and what a city should not look like. And I will show that as we go through the program.
Okay, so we're going to find out what they did right and what they did wrong there.
Right and wrong are subjective terms, so I have an opinion, an interpretation, and others may, again, think differently, but I've got a lot of evidence behind what I say.
Okay, so you have an interest in our local history here?
I've been teaching historic sites, historic preservation, ever since I came here in 1984. And so this is the area I publish in. This is the area that I've taught. And I'm also teaching just U.S. history, so I plug Plattsburgh's story into the context of U.S. history in the late 19th, early 20th century.
Okay, so even though you're retired, you haven't hung it up, and your interest is still there.
As long as my eyesight is still good and my heart is still kicking, I'm here.
All right, Jim, thank you very much.
You're most welcome.
I'm Helen Nurska from the Clinton County Historical Association, and we're very lucky to have with us tonight Jim Lindgren. This presentation is new to everybody, perhaps not to Jim, but certainly to us, and we're very pleased to be able to offer it. I'm going to turn it now over to Jim, and if you can't hear, let him know. He has a history of projecting to 250 kids, so I'm thinking he might make it, but you can let us know.
Thank you, Helen. Good evening. Thanks for coming out tonight. As Helen suggested, if I need a booming voice, and I will ask occasionally if you can hear me. And if you don't, just make it known and I will speak a little bit louder. When I first came to Plattsburgh in 1984, I was again a junior assistant professor, and I was assigned a course of 260 students in Yoakum 200, which is this gigantic auditorium. And I spoke without a microphone, mostly because microphones are in many ways a hindrance. So I try to speak to you directly, and I will do that tonight. As I said, I came to Plattsburgh in 1984, and I retired 37 years later in 2021. Over those years, I taught what's called public history. And so I taught historic preservation, and my students went around the city of Plattsburgh, and we pretty much covered all the domestic architecture, again, investigating its history and its controversy. I also taught historic sites, again, famous places, and one of the days I spent on City Hall and McDonough Monument, so I play off of that too. I also taught a course on history museums. And so over the course of the years, I've been very active in what's called public history And that's where most of my publications have occurred. I also taught late 19th, early 20th century US, the so-called Gilded Age and Progressive Era. And that's what you can see right here, late 19th and early 20th century. So I play off, in many ways, what I taught, and in some ways, what my students taught me about the history of Plattsburgh through the inventories that they conducted. Tonight's program is going to be, as you can see, the creative destruction of Plattsburgh. I take the title from one of my colleagues who was the head of the public history program at University of Massachusetts. And he wrote a book, The Creative Destruction of Manhattan. I do the creative destruction of Plattsburgh. A little smaller piece of turf, right? Okay. So I take the title off of Max Page and play it from there. Now, what I'm going to do is divide tonight's work into chapters, just so I can break it down a little more easily. And I'll explain these one by one in a minute, but as you can see, the title really plays off chapter 5, Demolishing a Neighborhood for a Progressive Backdrop, and that's what you see there. But you know, historians always have to go into context. Context is crucial. You can't understand what happens unless you know what precedes it. The who, the what, the where, the why, the when, the how, and so forth. So that's what I run through from number 1 through number 4, and I close up with kind of a postscript reaffirming that progressive city. So I begin in 1867 with the fire, okay, and then I go on to how the fire led to this rise of a local elite, industrial, financial, commercial, people who often came to town and made Plattsburgh a different type of, well, I should say village. It wasn't a city until 1902. And then I look at how and what they did. That's chapter 3 and so forth. So these are the 6 areas I will go through. The background, the rise of the local elite, how they expanded the infrastructure, again, the factories and so forth, how they, again, created this progressive city, and how that led them to demolish this neighborhood, which used to be called River Street, which we now call City Hall Place, and how that led to the Plattsburgh that many of us know since then. But did this turn off, or okay? Begin chapter 1, the fire, August 21st. Here we are, August 22nd. So we're 1 day late in marking the anniversary of the fire that destroyed much of downtown. And no, it wasn't Mrs. O'Leary's cow that did it, okay? But it did occur in a carriage house, a stable. The fire kind of swept next to the Presbyterian Church, went toward Margaret, went up to both sides of the bridge, and then down Margaret Street and destroyed much of downtown. And you can see $750,000 in damage was, again, the product. After that fire, there was a quick rebuilding. And here's a bird's eye from 1877. You know, back in those days, again, people would go up in a balloon, and they would kind of sketch out what they see, and they would put it down into a pattern. And this is what Plattsburgh looked like. And so what we're talking about, what we're talking about is Plattsburgh, and this is the area of downtown that's going to be rebuilt. Just to give you an example, though, I'll show you later how 20 years later there's this remarkable, again, construction going on. The church was the point where the fire began, and the church was quickly rebuilt. First Presbyterian was the first church in town, and here is again the structure from 1816, and here is this gigantic Gothic replacement that followed within the 10 years after the fire. Other rebuilding was done. Again, what you have is Trinity Park, or it used to be called Market Square, new fire facilities there. All the wires that are so typical of late 19th century, kind of obscuring one's view of the buildings, but were a mark of progress back in those days, were again also the product of the fire. What's most obvious after the fire is the change in Plattsburgh's population. It began in the 40s, but continuing rapidly in the years after the Civil War, we've got the influx of French Canadians. And this is all through New England, all through New York, and the French Canadians are ones who are going to find much of the change in the town because of their sheer numbers. Now, when you think of these immigrants, and I told my students and we explored the nativism that was the era's, again, there's a lot of backlash against them. And they experience it, and this is one reason why they're going to form pretty much their own community. They were led by the Reverend Père Jean-Pierre Bernard. That stern face gives you some sense of the discipline of the community. Kind of reminds me of the pastor of the church I went to when I was in grade school, and the nuns who were, again, very strong in discipline, okay, particularly to young boys. But that, again, Father Bernard was the first of the pastors of the parish. Now, the French Canadian community is also going to develop its own institutions. So you've got the female seminary, the Youville Seminary, which is expanded. The section on the right is the 1890s edition. The next decade, they're going to build, again for the boys, this Academy de Saint-Pierre. And so the French Canadians in Plattsburgh had their own school system. And they were very keen on creating that French Canadian identity. They also had associations through which they organized. And so l'Association de Saint-Jean-de-Baptiste, which was founded in 1871 across the border, in Plattsburgh also. The neighborhood most of them lived in was right next to the church, and so you've got Champlain Street, Lafayette Street, and what was called Platt Street back then, but which has since been renamed Montcalm Street. Distinct French-Canadian identity all the while. Now, if you look at these Plattsburghers, remember this is a village, look at these villagers. If you break it down, and this is, again, 1880, almost 40% were French Canadians, almost 40% were other, and the other were mostly Yankees. They were ones descended from earlier days or came from New England, and the remaining maybe 25% were Irish. Okay? The Irish came from downstate, they came from New England, even some came from Canada. And so what we have is a village where you've got distinct ethnic identities, often clashing with one another. If you look at the breakdown further, what you have is the fact that the French Canadians were dirt poor. They owned almost nothing. And that's going to be a mark of the jobs they took and how Plattsburgh develops. Okay? Nearby were other churches, the Protestant churches, Trinity Episcopal. Okay? Nice, impressive structure. Even more impressive was the Methodist Episcopal Church, the Methodist Church. And this is on Oak Street, right at the foot of Clinton Street. It's going to later burn. This is where the long apartments are now. Okay, so that was, again, mark of, again, Plattsburgh's identity through its churches. Yes. Now, if you think of how we can look at these people, we're going to see that Plattsburgh is made by this elite who are often coming into town. And they saw advantages. First of all, there's plenty of labor. It was unskilled immigrant labor, people who were desperate for jobs because of their poverty. At the same time, the businessmen in town, as well as the cardinal over in Quebec, were fiercely anti-union. And they want to make sure that, again, the workers owed their loyalty to the church rather than a union boss. The elite who came to town also saw a lot of opportunity through the resources. The trees, okay, the forests of the Adirondacks, the iron of the Adirondacks, and in our case, the water that was, again, the Saranac River. These were often, as I mentioned, out of state or out of the country, people coming to town. And for some of them, they were Canadians who came to town to avoid the Terra. It kind of reminds me of the 1980s development in Plattsburgh. They came because if they produced something in Canada, it had tariff if it was across the border. If they produced it here, again, they could sell within the United States. And so these are the advantages that they had. But if you look at the workers were, again, typical for the era, gendered work. And so men did men work and women did women's work. And the men, for example, at Isham Carriage Works, again, which was right next to the railroad track on the north side of town, or the women who worked in the steam laundry, were often, again, low paid, but again, it was the work that they had, again, bargained to do. Now, if you look at one of the employers, Plattsburgh Shirt Factory, as I say here, it was typical for textile mills for the day. They worked at the pace of the machine that drove their work. They were paid by the piece. They had to work fast. They were non-union. They were, again, controlled. You see this, there's one guy here, I think that's him there. He was the one who managed everything. And these women, as you can see in the wage, they got $4 to $5 per week. And they didn't work a full 52 weeks. They were lucky to work when they could. And so you kind of figure at the most $200 a year. Okay. At the same time, the 1890s, a middle class income was about $2,000 and up. So it would be 10 times what these girls earned at the Plattsburgh, again, shirt factory. Now, if you look at these workers, they lived, here's the Saranac weaving through. They lived often in this neighborhood. I'll show that in a minute. This was prone to flooding of the day. And they could work maybe they lived maybe in tenements down here. But the river came through. You can see the dam that used to be in town. Okay, we just drove through Swanton. Swanton still has got the dam right there. Okay, here's the old iron bridge. Okay, and so what you see is the logs come down, and here we go to the mouth of Saranac River, the so-called Water Street. Now these workers, for example, lived in that district right at the turn of the river. As I said, prone to flooding. Now, one of the landlords who owned buildings there said these tenements were only fit for French Canadians or workers of that sort. Okay, and so it was kind of condescending. He saw, again, opportunity, though, because he would be earning his rent. And so they would live, for example, here's one, Standish Street. My students inventoried this. It's got a boomtown front. It was probably divided in half, and maybe there'd be borders. We don't know essentially. But you can see the turn of the river and the flooding that would occur therein. Now, if you talk about the Catholics, we go back to the fact that the French Canadians developed their own church, as I said, opened in 1855. The Irish community had its own church. And again, when you think of St. John the Baptist, okay, a very impressive edifice, as you can see, from 1868, and by the time it would be opened in 1875. It was built as it was supposed to be the bishopric. It's supposed to be where the bishop of this diocese would reside. Because at that time, St. Peter's was in the Montreal diocese. And what occurred, though, was that downstate they decided not to have the cathedral here at St. John's, but they moved it Ogdensburg. It's the middle of nowhere, it seems like. Plattsburgh is active, but Ogdensburg is further in, and that was the choice of the downstate Catholic leaders. But St. John the Baptist would be the Irish church, as it would be called for years thereafter. Now, if you look at this era, as I said, it's called the Gilded Age. The Gilded Age, Mark Twain originated the term with an 1869 book, but I'm going to look at the period from 1873, when the worst depression up till then in U.S. history occurred. And that's where I'm going to take it up to the demolition of that neighborhood. One person who best represents that is Christopher Norton. He came to town. He was often referred to as the lumber baron. He owned 200,000 acres of forests in the Adirondacks. He had 3 lumber mills in town, and he used that wood as he created an iron industry. Now, he produced iron through what was called the Cumberland forges. They used charcoal. Now, remember that, and we'll go back to our basic chemistry in a minute about British thermal units. What creates heat? Charcoal is good if you want to grill your chicken, but it ain't the best if you want to make iron, okay? So Christopher Norton came to town. He established these forges right downtown. Here's, again, here's the Saranac River. Here's the bridge, the old iron bridge, and so he had his operation right there. He was also in the state legislature. He tried to take over the Saranac River when he was in the state assembly. He was blocked. And so he is trying to shape Plattsburgh to his own benefit, but it doesn't work, and he goes belly up in 1878. He fails, bankruptcy. He leaves town. He goes to Colorado, okay? So he's like a lot of businessmen who tried but failed, and that's going to be seen in his work right there. Now, what's interesting is that his house was this, and it was then bought by Smithweed. Smithweed is going to be, well, I always told my students, you think of the 2 most powerful men in Plattsburgh in the last 150 years. You got Smithweed, and you've got Ron Stafford. Okay? Both of them operate out of this house. Okay? So it kind of is a symbol of power. Okay? It still is. It's a beautiful Victorian Italian name. Now Smithweed, he was a native New Yorker. He was Harvard-educated law school. He came to town with a lot of ambitions, and he saw his future through the railroad. And so Smithweed is going to be one who is active, as I'll say, in politics. He's active in boosterism. He's active in trying to manipulate the economy to his and Plattsburgh's advantage. So Smithweed, the New York Times is going to call him the railroad man. And it was really seen that his future was through the D&H Railroad. Now, what's going to happen is Smithweed is going to be frustrated, and I'm going to show that a little bit later, frustrated by his railroad connections. All right? Now, another Plattsburgher who came to town was Shepherd Bowen. He's from Quebec. Okay? He comes to town, and he sees opportunity. He joins the iron industry. He founds a bank. Okay? He goes into city politics. But I think he's most remembered for the house he left behind. He bought this simple square house, okay, a Federal, okay, from the early 1800s, 1815 about, and he turned that house into this beautiful Italian villa mansion. And if you think of this, this is the type of mansion that, again, was Babbitt. Sinclair Lewis wrote about these men on the make and how they represented themselves through the buildings that they lived in. And again, Shepherd Bowen's mansion is still a wonderful piece of architecture in town. Right, as you can see on the side here, he's got a chapel. And the chapel was decorated with artwork by Richard Morris Hunt. If you go to Newport, Rhode Island, you see the mansions that Richard Morris Hunt is associated with. So Hunt even worked in Plattsburgh. So this is kind of symbolic of, again, how Plattsburgh is changing. And this is fortunate for us, still with us today. Now, right down the street was another man, and he's going to live 14 addresses further down, and that's Andrew Williams. Andrew Williams is also a Quebecer, and he's going to build this mansion. It's in the French, again, Empire style. My students would be asked to identify all the features of it, and they would have to get it all down, because architecturally it's very significant. It's survived later mayors who wanted to demolish it, and it's with us today, though it's much, much mangled. Now, this house was assessed at $116,000, which was the highest in the city at the time. It was a mansion, okay? And I'll talk about Andrew Williams in a few minutes, but he's characteristic of these men who come to town and again establish their prominence. Now, other mansions are going to be built. Samuel Vilas, who today we know about the Vilas home. Samuel Vilas was a Vermonter. He saw this area, Plattsburgh, as opportunity. Plattsburgh was a frontier, and opportunity was to be found here. And he built this beautiful house. Here is Brinkerhoff, and here is a Catherine Street. And the house is, well, it's been changed, became Mount Assumption Institute, it's been enlarged, it's kind of lost in the framework that's still there. But Samuel Vilas was also very prominent because he established Vilas Bank and so forth. Now, if you go further out, you get the W.W. Hartwell house, okay, it was his second house. Oops, sorry. Let's see. Did we lose it?
There's no signal.
No signal. Well, go back. Fast forward here, let's see, fast forward backwards. Okay. Aha, okay. W.W. Hartwell's house, okay. It's still with us today. It's for sale if anybody wants to invest their money in an opportunity, okay. Now, if you go even further out, Merritt Soles was from Vermont. He established a hardware business up here. Next door was Ebenezer Winslow. That's this building here, Soma Linda. If you know where Plattsburgh Plaza is, okay, with the Chinese restaurant is now there, and Myers Drug used to be there and so forth, that's where this is. And so they are pushing further and further out along Cornelia or Broad Street. So Plattsburgh is growing westward as these men come to town and want a piece of real estate to express their standing and to show their ambitions. Now, the first man to build on the lake was John Weaver. Again, he established a bank also, served in Congress, and he was one who would lobby for the extension of the Army base. I'll talk about that too. Now, his house, which became the Elks Club in 1916, is the first one built on the lake. So to make it short, these men came to town and they wanted architecture to express their ambitions, their wealth, their standing, and they left a nice legacy if it is preserved. Now, remember we talked about Plattsburgh after the fire. This is 1877. Now, if you go 10 years later, the place has boomed. And so this is the era I'm talking about, 1870s, 80s, into the 90s, and how this is going to create the ambitions that are going to lead to the eventual demolition of that neighborhood. Now, I want to go briefly into the problems they face, though. And the problems are almost typical when we think about today. Technology is changing so fast, these men can't keep up with it. To give you an example, again, when you think about that iron foundry that Norton had, it used charcoal, but go back to your chemistry classes, you know, coal creates more heat, more British thermal units. And so he's out of date. At the same time, iron is out of date. It's being replaced by steel. That's this Bessemer steel. So Carnegie and U.S. Steel are going to be going along that line. I mentioned U.S. Steel, and J.P. Morgan created that at the turn of the century, and that's showing how monopolies are also the threat to Plattsburgh business. Because these monopolies and the mergers that, again, they lead to are concentrating wealth. And that concentration of wealth is going to be a characteristic of 20th century all the way up till 2023. So what these men of Plattsburgh faced are, again, these stronger corporations elsewhere. They also lacked capital, money, and that's because of the gold standard. The gold standard was like a boa constrictor around America's economy because it didn't have the money necessary for growth. Today, if you follow the news, you hear about the M1 money supply, the Federal Reserve, quantitative easing. It's all these obscure terms, but the economy needs money to grow, and there wasn't enough in the late 19th century because of the gold standard. That led to deflation, a crunching in. Also, the South and the West were growing. So across the nation, limited capital meant meant that there were constraints on Plattsburgh. The era is also known for frequent depressions and recessions, and the Saranac River, contrary to Smithweed's hope, didn't provide enough power for the factories that they wanted. An example, Williams Manufacturing, okay? I mentioned Andrew Williams, that beautiful house at 8 Macomb Street. He headquartered his corporation in Montreal. He came down here to take advantage of the cheap labor and in many ways access to U.S. markets. Now, he produced sewing machines and typewriters. Now, if you think of those mergers I was mentioning, the monopoly, Andrew Williams had the help make sewing machine. It didn't help him, though, because 75% of the U.S. market was controlled by Singer's sewing machine. And so you got these other people fighting for that tiny 25% that's left over. It ain't going to work. And so Andrew Williams faced trouble. Same thing with typewriters. You think of Remington and Underwood and these other companies. Typewriters were rapidly changing, too. And so Williams just couldn't keep up. Now, he started, and he again had to close in 1908 because of the recession. He reopened feebly and finally closed in 1922. But here, his building right there on the Saranac is impressive. I like this drawing, though, because here you see his building, and right across what we see is the coal gas plant. You know, the manufactured gas plant that became this disastrous EPA site that they're still trying to remedy. Well, take a look. There it is. It's right there at the turn of the century. So when you think of Andrew, again, Williams, he's facing trouble. Most of his workers are paid below the poverty level of New York State. And so, as I said, cheap labor is what they want to take advantage of. Now, the same thing is true. I mentioned about, again, modernization, pushing iron aside. Here's the Titan Foundry. You go Margaret Street all the way up, and Lozier is going to eventually take over the building. And this is the one you still see, that distinctive sloped walls. I'm not sure if it's going to be with us much longer, but the iron foundry there. Chateauguay Iron moved to town its corporate offices. And so what we have is, again, Plattsburgh is associated with the iron industry. The Saranac River was supposed to provide the water power, and if you see in this drawing, okay, here's the Iron Bridge, Bridge Street, and here is a mill, and the water, again, was entered. Here's the run coming out, often blocked by all the lumber the woods that are coming down. And so the Saranac River was that vital resource all this while, but they're kind of fighting for access to it. The textile mills, prominent in town. Okay, I mentioned also the Plattsburgh Shirt Factory. It was owned by an out-of-town company, headquartered in Troy. They had 6 textile mills in New York State, and Plattsburgh was one of them. As I said, these girls could be married, could be not, underpaid. This is a promotional picture taken of them. You know, they were ones who were tied to that sewing machine and the environment that it created. Lozier is the most famous company, but it wasn't here very long. Its owner was authoritarian who came to town precisely because he didn't want workers unionized. And Plattsburgh had that reputation. And so Lozier is going to move to town. By 1906, they're going to move their auto production solely in Plattsburgh. There's a strike in 1910. He doesn't like it one bit. And he threatens to move out, and he does. He closes in 1914, and that's the end of Lozier. All that's left is that slope building and one of the streets named after Lozier, okay? But Lozier, obviously an important company for its day. The real importance of Plattsburgh was for retail commerce. And anybody who can remember Margaret Street back in its heyday, it was booming in the early 20th century, it was booming in the 1950s, booming into the malls, okay? And so if you think of Plattsburgh's, here we got Margaret Street, rows of Victorian, again, structures, Katy Drug, here's Bridge Street right here, here's Margaret Street, Katy Drug burned, but it's, again, a beautiful edifice, and people came to town for their wares there. People came to town, stayed at the Cumberland Hotel, the Fouquet House, okay? And so the hotels were also ones that defined Plattsburgh. Chapter 3, if you look at the infrastructure that goes along with this, what occurred at the mouth of Saranac River was the Champlain Transportation Company first had ferries carrying cargo back and forth between Plattsburgh. Here's the railroad. Again, ferries would line up there, and you can still see that jump into the lake today. They had ferries coming in for cargo twice daily. By the 1890s, they had passenger ferries, okay, like the Ticonderoga, going to Burlington, back and forth. What we have is a regular exchange if people desire to go back and forth between Plattsburgh and, again, Burlington itself. The real change came with the railroad. And D&H Railroad, as I mentioned before, is pretty much the kingpin in town. Now, the railroad came to Plattsburgh first in 1852. It started in Plattsburgh and went up to the border and then Montreal, okay? And in the years after 1852, Plattsburghers tried to get the state to build the connection from Plattsburgh down to Whitehall, to the south. And it just didn't happen with state funding. Finally, what occurred was the legislature, again, influenced D&H to go ahead. In 1875, the railroad was built, and what you have happening 11 years later is the D&H station is built here. Built at the expense of $22,000. What can you get for $22,000 today? You can't even get a mobile home, can you? Okay? And so the D&H had this impressive building. Now, I get into debates. Steve Engelhardt says it's Queen Anne. Others say it's this and that. It was designed as a French Norman chateau. And so some would say it's chateau-esque, but if you've ever been to New York City or been to, again, Newport, Rhode Island, the chateaus there are magnificent mansions like kings would live in. This doesn't look like a king would live in it, but we're a frontier town. So this was a chateau, so built at the expense of $22,000, and Plattsburgh was a hub because by 1878, we were connected not only to downstate, but to Montreal, and we were connected because Smithweed persuaded the state legislature to build a spur out to Dannemora. And so all the commerce from the Adirondacks would start to filter back into Plattsburgh. D&H and Weed then helped build the spur out to Chateauguay. And so Plattsburgh really is, as I use the word, it's a hub. Okay? It's a hub for northeastern New York. Now you also see right here the traction, again the trolley. Now we often call these interurbans. Now this one ran 6.5 miles in town, but there were other interurbans that ran down to, say, Sable Forks. When I go down to on Route 9 to Sable Forks, I can still see the tracks kind of embedded in the roadway. And so what was happening, people came to Plattsburgh and it looked like they piled aboard just to enjoy the trip out to the countryside or the trip through town. Now the traction company eventually was taken over by D&H, which starved it financially because the D&H saw that cars, automobiles were coming in. And so this is the power of the D&H for the local time. Okay? Now, that frustration is going to lead Smithweed to complain privately. Now, I'm going to read this to you in case you can't read it. I have learned this with corporations, he said, that the only way is to take what you can get. If you can't get what is right, take the next best thing that you can get. Smithweed was frustrated by his relationship with the D&H because they always had the trump card. They always had the winning hand. And Smithweed would be eventually pushed aside by the 1890s. We remember him as a powerful man, but he had fallen in stature because the D&H pushed him aside in the 90s. So the D&H is that powerful, again, maker of Plattsburgh. Plattsburgh is also, as we know, the government seat, Clinton County's Victorian Romanesque courthouse. Okay, here's the old custom house. I'm going to show you how they'll change later on. Plattsburgh is the health center of New York, northeastern New York. Champlain Valley Hospital, again, followed the Plattsburgh City Hospital that was downtown. This was run by the Grey Nuns of Canada. It was a secular hospital staffed by the nuns, okay? I taught at Plattsburgh State, and again, the parking lot next to me used to be where this hospital was, okay? And so Plattsburgh is the center of the health industry, and the YMCA, which used to be on the top of the D&H railroad station, developed its own building in 1895, and it wanted to teach proper values to fight unionization. Okay? And so what we have is the health center of New York is here. It became a military base too. As we probably all heard before, General William Tecumseh Sherman, the infamous general during the Civil War who supposedly burned Atlanta, had recommended that Fort Montgomery be the headquarters for the U.S. Army on the northern border. The federal government suggested that. But Congressmen and General Stephen and John Moffett, together with Smithweed and John Weaver, fought to make Plattsburgh the base. And that happened, again, to the point where in the 1890s, Plattsburgh is going to go through this sudden expansion. And so Plattsburgh is known as the military town. The learning hub of New York. The normal school built here in 1889, as I said before, there are so many French-speaking Catholics in northern New York that Albany worried about what type of history was being taught, what type of culture is being created. And so the mission of the normal school was to teach Yankee values to these newcomers, these immigrants, to bring them on board. And this is true for so many of the normal schools that became SUNY colleges. Plattsburgh State has got that origin right there. Plattsburgh Academy, right there on Oak Street, again at Brinkerhoff, again fulfilling a similar mission. This is going to be replaced by the Plattsburgh High School in 1916. Now, what's interesting too is Plattsburgh is the cultural capital of northeastern New York. And Smithweed is one who is to be credited with this. This building here is much to his credit. Kind of packed tightly onto Marion Street there, off of Clinton. It's an impressive auditorium when you think this is a gigantic theater stage for the era. And Plattsburgh had traveling venues come to town, a couple operatic or dramatic performances, constant types of programs there to make Plattsburgh known as the cultural capital of this area. People came for summer tourism. The D&H is responsible for Hotel Champlain, which burned 20 years later, like so many hotels in the Adirondacks, became tinder, and so they rebuilt it in 1910. Supposedly fireproof construction. Next door, you've got the Catholic summer camp, so people came to Plattsburgh for this. Now, the next chapter I want to go to is starting to get into progressivism. This is my field. I wrote 2 books on the Progressive era, one on Virginia, the other on New England. And this kind of Plattsburgh plays to a T what is happening across the nation. First of all, America and Plattsburgh was growing so fast. People felt disorder. People felt chaos. People felt alienation. And so Robert Wiebe, one historian, called this the search for order. That's what we're going to look at here. How to reorder America so that despite all this immigration and modernization and industrialization and you know what, we're going to come out with a more unified America. One of the tools for that was civic boosterism. And I'll be talking about how Plattsburgh fits into that. Historical monuments, historical pageants, historical plays, historical memory fits into how to bring people together. And also part and parcel of this is the City Beautiful movement. And that's where the monument, McDonough Monument and City Hall fit right into a T. Now, the village became a city in 1902. Most Plattsburghers don't know this or realize this. Clyde Rabideau, when he was mayor, called me up on the phone and he wanted me to head his Centennial Commission. Wanted me to write the book on Plattsburgh. One of my unwritten rules is not to write books about cities I live in. Okay? You know, I like to have people like me, okay? But when you think about the city, it was incorporated again in 1902. A new form of government, council, mayor, and that's going to be the decision, the modus operandi for these decisions about what to demolish and what to keep coming into play. Now, one of the problems for Plattsburgh was, as I said before, these competing identities. The French Canadians, the community, would celebrate Saint Jean the Baptiste Day, just like they would do up in Quebec. And that's on June 24th. And here they're lining up on Brinckerhoff Street. Here's the Hartnett House right behind it, this beautiful, eclectic, eccentric wood house right next to the YMCA today. At the same time, the Yankees in town would celebrate Old Home Week. It began in New Hampshire, and the whole idea was to teach Yankee values, to remind these newcomers that, well, it was England that established the United States. It wasn't some other presence. And so we have our kind of competing memories, French versus English, and again, early 20th century Plattsburgh. This is where the Champlain story comes into play. Now, what we're going to be talking about is this area right here. Okay, so I showed you where the railroad comes through, and here's the Saranac mouth. I'll talk about these 3 islands that used to be there. Again, here's the downtown. So this is where the Champlain Monument is going to be built. Across the street, here's the Kent de Lord. Okay, and see, here's Smithweed's house and so forth. So this is what we're going to be talking about here, how Samuel de Champlain fits into this. Now, when you think about de Champlain, no one really knows what he looked like. Again, so there's going to be a lot of room for historical creativity about Champlain's role. But the celebration began in 1909. A lot of parades, a lot of festivity. If you look back from 2023, some controversy too about who is depicted and how. But it was so important that here we got President Taft coming to stage, Governor Charles Evans Hughes coming to stage. It's a big to-do because it's supposed to, as I say up here, it's supposed to unite the community. All right? That leads to the Terra Centennial Monument in 1912, funded in good part by the French, who are trying to help shape that identity of the United States. Here it is right here. It leads to the beautification of the Saranac River. Again, with painting, you can kind of take out the sore parts. You can kind of blot over what's not nice. You can kind of create a figment of your imagination. And this painting pretty much does it. It looks a very pretty spot, doesn't it? Okay. If you look at that spot, though, what we realize, and this is chapter 5, well, it's Blight. Now, one of those islands was a garbage dump. And if you look at Plattsburgh history, it used to be where cholera would always break out during the summer, 1840s and 1850s, because it was just out of control. So you got a garbage dump on one of the islands. Right across, you've got Baker's Mill. And there are a lot of lumber mills in town because the forests of the Adirondacks were so easy to tap into and money to make off of. Progressives and their City Beautiful movement want to kind of control this blight. They wanted progress, but they didn't want the blight. It's kind of hard to figure that equation, but that was their goal right there. So there's going to be a campaign to make Plattsburgh more beautiful. Now, it was made possible in good part by Loyal Smith. He's one of these unmentioned characters in Plattsburgh history. He was a philanthropist, and I'll mention another contribution he made at the same time, but he kicked in almost $200,000 to the city to build what was hoped to be the City Hall. At this time, Plattsburgh's government met in the Weed Building, kind of on an upper floor, kind of out of sight. Loyal Smith wanted something more prominent. At the same time, the state legislature established the Plattsburgh Centennial Commission because they were thinking about the anniversary of McDonough's victory in 1814. And so what's going to happen eventually with this is that the state and the feds are going to kick in about $125,000 each to fund the eventual monument. So we got the bequest here, and we've got the public money here, and this is going to be the spark that leads to Plattsburgh's new identity, and that's what we're going to talk about. One suggestion that went to the city, architects James Roddy Gordon of New York City. Now let me read this just because it gets the sense of City Beautiful across. In this particular case, he says, this building is a memorial and should have a park setting where the landscape will be as important as the building, and the quiet and cleanliness should be supreme, that it may be the showplace of your city and may be of such a character and embody such refinement and purity of architecture as to render it conspicuous among our country's notable public buildings. Now, this is a real statement of how he wants to redo Plattsburgh. Think of this: quiet, cleanliness, purity. You know, that's a real cultural statement because Plattsburgh was seen as disorderly, chaotic, too much, again, too many buildings mixed together with no sense of real identity. So this is going to be the suggestion that's followed through. Now here's the neighborhood that is going to be targeted. Now let me explain. Okay, here is Cornelia. Here is what we call now City Hall Place, all right? And here is, that's Trinity Church right back there. But here's Trinity Park, used to be Market Square, and here's Court Street. Here's the River Bridge, and Smithweed's house is over there. Now, what we're going to be talking about is this, sorry. I'm going to be talking about what we're going to be talking about is, where is this slide? Okay. Did we disconnect?
Yes.
Okay, let's go back. Okay, what we're going to be talking about is an area from here, here's the river, this whole area is going to be erased down to Mother Earth, all right? And this area, as I will show you, is considered a blight. Now here's the railroad coming into town. Where are we coming into town? Here is the first Catholic church still standing. Here's the spire from Trinity. So the D&H Railroad's coming through, and here's the bridge. And so people who are on this train see a mess. And it's a neighborhood that is mixed industry, commercial, residential, tenements, and so forth. They see an area that is mixed, and it's one that is characterized by the industry and grind. And so this is the area we're talking about. Now, the area was one that, here's the former church, okay, it's still standing. Harry Fu had his Chinese laundry in front, okay. The doors have their meat market in front. There was a fish store there, okay. So it served the neighborhood. These are all storefronts built on top in front of that church. Across the street was the Palace Theater, vaudeville, dramatic plays, some of the early movies, Kinetoscope and so forth. People went to there. The neighborhood also included, here's a horse stable, here's Trinity Park, okay, horse stables. There were 2 horse stables, some tenements, some decent houses. All this is going to be erased down to ground zero. Okay? Now, it was a controversial move. And what we have is an election coming up. Now, it was the mayoral election. Now, the development wasn't a specific campaign goal of one or the other, but it was implicitly stated therein. It's not like the development we had recently proposed for downtown, where people knew what was going on. Because if you look at the numbers, in 1910 there were 15,000 people in town, but only 600 and some people voted. Okay? And the ward that voted against it was the ward that would be demolished. The rest of the town voted to undertake this. And so with eminent domain, you know the way that works, again they have to determine valuation. And Smithweed said, keep the press out. He wanted things to be as quiet as possible so that you could get the process through and get done with it. As a result, the small shopkeepers, the artisans, they would lose out. Oftentimes they owed back taxes on the land, or they had mortgages. They were given a low valuation, and they would be the losers in this story. On the other hand, Andrew Williams owned this big laundry business right on the river. And as the condemnation proceeding explained, a lot of the building was in bad condition, and in many cases nothing less than filthy. But Andrew Williams got a good price, because Andrew Williams was Andrew Williams. So what we have happening is the decision-making behind what is kept or destroyed, what is again valued and not, is a subject of politics. Now this all fits into the City Beautiful movement. Now you've probably heard of the Chicago World's Fair in 1893. It set off this drive. World's fairs throughout the country, even one in Buffalo. Okay, and that's where President McKinley met his maker. Okay, so what we have is the City Beautiful movement is going on at the time, and it's driven by progressive planners. Now, progressivism isn't, again, the great Teddy Roosevelt busting monopolies and so forth. The progressive movement is, again, it's like all these different people under an umbrella, and they have all this search for order. Progressives tended to be Protestant, middle class, educated, and people who lived in the cities or people who lived in the suburbs around those cities. They were educated. They wanted to put order into America. And so they have these biases that historians have later shown to be the drivers of their action, but that's what the progressive movement was all about. It spread across the nation. About a dozen years ago, the National Park Service hired me to evaluate a proposed national park in St. Louis. And when I looked there, went there, did the research, submitted my report to Congress, again, what I'm describing essentially is the City Beautiful movement there, and it fits into the same pattern as Plattsburgh, because they want to put order into a city that was seen as chaotic. They want to, again, separate people by class. They want to have pretty buildings, particularly classic buildings. They want, in many ways, all these changes. So when you think about the City Beautiful movement, it's going to be one that is nationwide, and as I say here, it's going to become an urban renewal movement. Erase, demolish, and create something more pretty. It's going to lead to displacing certain populations to create that. And it's going to favor the haves and not the have-nots of society. So that is a problem with progressivism of the early 20th century. And it plays out here in Plattsburgh as well. What we have as a result is this. Now, as I said before, this is probably the prettiest spot in Plattsburgh. You know, today, if we go downtown today, you know, downtown's a mess because of the construction. You go to here and you think, wow, how beautiful this is. And so there is a positive result of this attempt to accent the river, accent academic classicism, the nobility of classical architecture and so forth. City Hall, a very pretty edifice. Okay. John Russell Pope is the architect. He's the one who did the Jefferson Memorial, and if you've ever been there, and the pretty setting with the cherry trees, gorgeous, okay? And so aesthetically, it's gorgeous, but you know, there's a cost to pay, and that cost is the people who lose their homes, lose their land, and lose out with these eminent domain proceedings. And so this is the City Beautiful image that was created. Now, Plattsburgh tries to continue this progressivism. And so this is kind of my postscript, because it's going to lead to a new YMCA, $20,000 kicked in by Loyal Smith, another one of his benefactions, okay, helping. He wanted to create this positive image for Plattsburgh. A new hospital created by the Protestant doctors who didn't like the Grey Nuns' control over Champlain Valley Hospital. Okay. A new normal school after the one burned in 1928. And you know, this was a nice Romanesque piece of architecture. This is a more stately, more commanding, more authoritarian. This plays off the English tradition. This is Tudor style, you know, Henry VIII and so forth. This Tudor style harkens back to Plattsburgh's English roots, built to a cost of $1 million. A lot of money poured into the state by this building. Also a new cultural city. Tragically, Plattsburgh Theater burned in 1928. You can see the fire taking over the top here. And it was never replaced, but you've got alternatives coming in. And say we see the Strand Theater. Has a lot of potential. Hope we get there with it. Okay. A new government center. This building goes down, and again the post office and custom halls here. This is a federal building from 1930. New neighborhoods, and particularly I like to focus on Court Street. Okay, this is again east of kind of the eastern section between Oak and Catherine, and here's west of Catherine. This was a postcard. And so people sent postcards across the country of how beautiful Court Street was. And it was. Now, I'm going to mention this in a minute, but we're going to think of all the tragedy that's going to hit Court Street in the 60s and 70s. And I'll mention that just in a minute. And so what we're going to close tonight, in conclusion, I'm going to ask this question: what prompted this creative destruction? First of all, Loyal Smith's 200,000 bequests. Praise him. And he's got, in many ways, he kicks off the process. But what follows, the fuel for this, is in many ways this progressive idea about City Beautiful and all the ideas behind it, which we can discuss. Also, it's the perceptions of a faltering economy. Technology was changing. Bankruptcies were happening. Companies were moving out. Plattsburgh needed to attract capital. And that's why that picture you have of the bridge and what was around the city. capitalists coming from New York City, going through town, coming down from Montreal, would have an image of Plattsburgh before this negative. But with City Beautiful, it would be a positive image of how beautiful Plattsburgh was and what an investment it could be. What also occurred was this idea that was typical of the era, out with the old and in with the new. You know, I've been teaching historic preservation for 40 years, and this has been in many ways the curse of historic preservation, because Americans tend to look to the future, and they don't really realize what good things are there from the past. And that's why I say these are the limits of historic preservation of the era. And so these all combine to explain that creative destruction. Now, if you want another postscript, I'm not sure if anybody's met Alan Everest. Alan Everest was, again, on the faculty of the history department at Plattsburgh State through the 50s, into the 60s, into the 70s. He retired just as I was coming in. But a book that he wrote in 72 explains how this curse of Plattsburgh is still with us, as so much of Plattsburgh history was being erased. Those beautiful houses on Court Street became slums. So much of Plattsburgh was again, unappreciated. The city itself wanted to destroy the Point District and put up high-rise urban renewal type buildings. Alan Everest fought this, and his subtitle says it all: Architecture Worth Saving in Clinton and Essex counties. And so this is one lesson we still need to learn, and Alan Everest again repeated in this book. And again, think of the past as we look to the future and meld the two together. Now, it's still happening, just within our own years, okay? Alan Everest's own home on Catherine Street. Pretty Gothic revival structures in the form of a cross. Gothic revival, at its best, demolished, okay? Another building recently demolished is Ebenezer Winslow's Carriage House. Again, the building was called Soma Linda. It's up there on the hill of Upper Cornelia Street, just demolished 2 years ago. So we're still losing buildings that should be protected because they tell so much about our past. And so when you think about this creative destruction, the destruction is still going on. Whether it's creative is a question that we need to discuss and debate. So that's pretty much it. As I mentioned before, if I can plug my own work, okay? I don't have books to sell here or anything like that. But this is what I've been writing about through my whole career as a historian. I did a book, as it says here, on preservation of Virginia. Here's Jamestown. Here's Old Colonial New England, another book. Here's South Street Seaport. If anybody's from the city, you know, in the shadow of the Brooklyn Bridge, you've got South Street Seaport here. And in the most recent book, Preserving Maritime America, I go back to looking at how America is, again, a maritime nation. Our sea coast, our history pulls us to the sea, and I try to explain that. So when you think about Plattsburgh's creative destruction, I try to see our city within the context of this larger picture of America, trying to understand its past, but I hope trying also to appreciate it. So that's all I have for today. I'm open if you have any questions and try to carry it on from there. Yes?
Was it easy to come back and forth over the border in those days? I mean, you just...
Relatively so, yeah. And so it's not like today. And you know, I've been living here since 1984, and even before, in the early days before 9/11, the border was much easier to cross. There would still be customs. Ever since the early 19th century, Plattsburgh was had the border customs for this northeastern part of New York. And so most of the traffic would come through, again, the ship. That's why Plattsburgh is there. But Peter Saley, if you go to the Saley House out there on Cumberland Ave, he was one of the first customs collectors. So it's changed. It was easier then than now. And that's because of the fear associated with who might get across. Other questions? Yes?
What happened to the Cholera Island and the other two islands? that-
They got merged together, and so the 3 islands were joined together, and so when you flush your toilet, think where it's going. It's going to the filtration plant that was set there. And that's the low point in Plattsburgh. And so Plattsburgh's sanitation system is built on, again, gravity flow going down, and that's where it's going. So in the 1840s, cholera was an outbreak, and now here in 2023, we're trying to use that sanitation plant to prevent any future cholera, okay? So that's what we have today. Yes?
Don't we have some pumping now for the sewage?
Yeah,
The wastewater, excuse me.
Yeah, there's pumping so as to create that flow down, okay? And it's still associated with this mouth of the Saranac River. And a lot of people, since I've been here, have proposed, get rid of that sanitation plant. It's a blight, and it holds down values on Cumberland Avenue. And if you're at the Kent Lord House on a bad day, it stinks, okay? But you know, if it's a low point, there's a problem there. And the federal government helped build it. It would want its monies back, I guess. And so there is kind of a structural problem. But there's pumping stations. For example, if you go up by Price Chopper, there's one there for the town. But
And on Cumberland Head, Champlain Park,
Yeah,
when
but
we flush, it goes to the Saranac.
it goes into the Saranac.
Yep, it goes from the old purification
Yeah.
that used to dump into the lake, which failed 10 years or so. And now it goes out, down Route 9 and near the Chamber of Commerce. That's the pumping station where the town connects with the city.
Yeah. So
So
this
we
was.
pay for export.
Yeah, this was a city, so the city and town are separate. You know, Georgia Pacific used to have its own filtration plant. If you go up Cumberland Avenue, you can see that, you know, right next to where, again, the remediation project is going on for the city. You know, Georgia Pacific had its own plant, and then it turned its duties over to the city. And so the city handles the waste. Okay. Other questions? Yes?
Does this, we used to live in Key West, and they had an historical association that basically had to approve demolition of buildings. Does the
Yeah.
city of Plattsburgh have anything like that?
Well, that's a good question, because there are historic districts in town. Clinton County Historical Associations helped sponsor an inventory back in the middle 70s and did an inventory of key areas within Plattsburgh. There's a Court Street Historic District, for example. And these buildings are listed, but they don't require, again, any type of approval or authorization for changes. This is one of the problems with historic preservation in the United States. In Europe, there's major funding to keep historic buildings looking historic. In the United States, there's a bureaucratic procedure to get any funding, if there is any available, to do that. And so Key West has got a very specific identity. You know, the Hemingway House and so forth. Key West has a very specific identity, but Plattsburgh has been always on the frontier and seems to be unable, unwilling. Now, I showed you pictures of New England, like that historic building on the front of the second book I wrote. You know, that's protected, and that's got restrictions through zoning. Plattsburgh has long resisted that because, if I may say so, the power of landlords and the power of the real estate industry is such that they don't want restrictions. And this is the way life is. Yes?
But again, with the two Plattsburghs, right, the town had very strict zoning and development plans.
Well, there's zoning, but the zoning doesn't necessarily protect Allen Everest's house, for example. Allen
Again,
Everest,
if nobody said, you know, was it, where was the location again?
26 South Catherine Street. And so right next door to the apartment house. And so
No,
I was talking to Stephen Engelhardt, who is head of Adirondack Architectural Heritage, and he was raised in Plattsburgh. And I mentioned it to him, he says, it happened so quickly, none of us had a chance to say anything about it. And that's the story of demolition. My wife and I used to live in Williamsburg, Virginia, and you think about colonial Williamsburg in this image. Well, Chloe Williamsburg realized that if it didn't like a building that was in its way and was slightly outside of its district, the bulldozer would come in at midnight. Okay? And quickly gone, and people don't have a chance to complain. So I've been teaching historic preservation with frustration, but you know, I recognize the reality that goes on. Okay? Other questions?
Right here.
Hello, yes.
Is that what happened to the Witherall Hotel?
The Wither Hotel, again on Margaret Street, was demolished to create the bank that bank that was destroyed a couple of years ago. And the Hotel Witherall was a meeting place in town. It precedes me, but if people would go to its bar, people would go to its dining room. It was the lively space on Margaret Street, and like a lot of Plattsburgh facilities, it was old-fashioned. Okay, and what did I say as I was closing? You know, this quest to get rid of the old and the unsightly, and you know, at times I kind of feel old and unsightly too. But you know, fighting for our own survival, right?
Yeah, but for that, we have the Department of Aging. There's some place to go and make your case.
Yeah. Now, I was asked if I was still continuing with my research, and I said, as long as my eyes are working and my heart is kicking, I will, but make it happen, right? Other questions? Well, thank you for attending, and
Very much.
you're all relieved.